Well, thank you for that kind introduction. I did understand a few words. Eric, Mazur, Leiden University, Harvard Ashway, So it's a pleasure to be back here and to be able to talk to you about educating innovators. And I think that dialogue should start with innovating education, because one of the arguments I will make is that if there is one particular sector of human activity that is in need of innovation, it is education. I've been teaching at Harvard for close to 35 years, long time. And when I started teaching at Harvard, a long time ago, I never asked myself the question, how am I going to teach? That's kind of strange, because when you start doing something new in your life, that should be the first question you ask yourself. Well, the question did not even come up in my mind. It was perfectly clear what I was going to do in the classroom. I was going to lecture. This here is a picture of me lecturing a long time ago. It's a very old picture. It was taken BC, before computers. I'm not that old. Now, why did I step into the classroom and started to lecture? I did that because not that long before this, I had been a student, and I'd seen my professors do that to me. I sort of projected my own experiences on the world around me. And I think we all tend to do that. We tend to project our experiences on the world around us. And I thought I had learned physics by sitting in a classroom listening to my professors talk about physics. And I'm sure that they too, my professors, when they started teaching, made exactly that same assumption. They had been taught in a classroom not very different from that one. And when they started teaching, they said, well, we're going to lecture. And I'm sure that the generation of professors before that made that same assumption, all the way back to this person here. This is actually an illustration from a manuscript published in the 14th century, hand-drawn, that was before printing press, showing a German king, who is there on the left, teaching a guest lecture at the University in Bologna in 1125, so almost, 900 years ago. Now, nowadays, when we teach, we don't wear those funny clothes anymore. We only wear those, at least in the US, I don't know about here, but in the US we wear them at graduation. What about here in Taiwan? Do you wear them at graduation? Same thing, okay. Right. But during the year we don't wear them anymore. But look at the similarity between this illustration and a picture of my own classroom, down to, some tiny details like this person here. You're laughing about it, but I think that the parallel I'm making is not that big of an exaggeration. Education has evolved very little since the university was founded over 1,000 years ago, or about 1,000 years ago, because that's when the University of Bologna first started teaching. Now, before we get into talking about more innovative approaches to teaching, let's briefly reflect on this image here. I would like you to describe to me the activity that is taking place on the screen behind me. One or two words, not long description. I want you to say one or two words that describe what is happening here. And ideally, I want to hear a verb. But there are two verbs I do not want to hear, teaching and learning. So you'll have to use other words. So go out, just blurt it out. Listening. I heard something else here in front.
Thinking.
Thinking. Writing. Boring? This is my classroom. But maybe you have a point. What else?
Not following.
Not following. Okay. You're very kind to me. I have to remind you, this is my class. That's me there. Let's hear some more. Notice that most of the things that we heard have to do either with the students or me. Listening. They're listening. I'm not listening. Because, you know, they're sitting there passively. I'm the one talking. So I don't need to listen. They're the ones listening. Writing. They're mostly writing. Well, here I happen to... No, I'm pointing. I'm not writing, actually. So, you know, I would like to... Boring. Maybe they're bored, but I cannot be bored there in front. That'd be really bad. So, you know, we're both in the classroom at the same time. What is it that is happening between them and me as we are in the classroom there?
You are not communicating.
I couldn't hear that louder.
You are not communicating with each other.
I am communicating or I'm not communicating?
Not.
One-way communication.
Ah, very good, because communication is a two-way process, right? So this is a one-way communication. What is it that I'm trying to communicate to them? And yes, this is a physics class, but you know, it doesn't matter whether it's physics or biology or Chinese or whatever the subject is. What is it that we as teachers are trying to communicate to our students?
Content knowledge.
Content knowledge. But think about it. Is knowledge really something that can be transferred? I see several people shake no. I think knowledge is something that needs to be constructed in the brain of the learner. It's not something that we can just transfer. It'd be great if we could transfer it. It would be even better if we could transfer it while people are sleeping. But, you know, I don't think that is possible. So if it is not knowledge that we are transferring, what is it? Inspiration? Maybe. But I hope that we're doing more than just that. What is it that is actually happening in an average classroom around the world, whether it's Taiwan or the US or Europe or anywhere else in the world? If it's not knowledge, what is it?
Creative curiosity.
Well, I'm looking for another word.
Information.
Information, exactly. Lectures and our standard approach to teaching is focused on transferring information. And you know what? My students had actually pointed that out to me very early in my career. You see, when I started teaching, I did not ask myself, how am I going to teach? I did have questions. There were questions that came up in my mind. Not, how am I going to teach, but what do you think? What, exactly? I asked myself, what am I going to teach? So I went to a colleague of mine and I knocked on his door. He had taught this course before I did. And I asked him that question and he said, oh, in this class, we have used in the past the book by Halliday and Resnick. If you're a physicist in this audience, you may know that book because it's been a classic book all around the world for probably, 60 years or so. Now, I was also told by my colleague that students in the US buy the textbook. That came somewhat as a surprise to me coming from Europe. As you heard, I was educated in the Netherlands at Leiden University. And for the introductory courses there, we would never buy the book. I mean, why buy the book if the instructor is presenting the book to you? You can save a lot of money by just writing down the notes. But anyway, my colleague told me, you have to be sure that there are enough books in the bookstore for the students. So about a month before the class started, I went to our bookstore, the Harvard Coop it's called, and I spoke to the person responsible for buying textbooks, and I said to that person, be sure that by September 15th, you have 150 copies of Halliday and Resnick in stock. And as I walked back to my office, I thought, if the students have the book by Howard and Resnick, and I have the same book, then what do I do in the classroom? So I knocked on my colleague's door and I asked him that question. And he said, oh, Eric, don't worry. There are lots of different physics textbooks. And he showed me a shelf full of books that he had collected over the course of his career. And I started to look at these books. And very quickly, I found the perfect book. It was perfect for two reasons. One, it was different from Howard and Resnick, so at least I was not just regurgitating the content of the book that the students had bought. But that was not the important reason. The important reason was the book was out of print. So for every class, I spent, maybe 10 hours writing lecture notes from that other book. And then in class, I would either project my notes on the overhead projector, as you see there, or I would write them on the board behind me. And because my notes were different from the textbook, I thought it would be good for the students to get a copy of the notes at the end of each classroom. Remember, this was BC, right before computers, so there was no internet. The only way was to give them a physical copy. So at the end of class, as they walked out, there were exits in the back, just like here. There was a big pile of photocopied notes. Now, why do you think did I hand them out at the end of class and not at the beginning of class? What do you think?
They would listen.
So they would listen, so they would pay attention. But isn't that not admitting that there is a problem? Why force the students to get the information out of my mouth if they could get it from simply reading the notes? That never came up in my mind. But you know what happened? At the end of that first year, the students had to fill out an evaluation of my class. And it's same as everywhere. There are some numerical questions and some multiple choice questions. At the end, there's space for comments. And at the end of that first year, about half a dozen students wrote in the comments section, Professor Mazur lectures straight from his lecture notes. Hello? I mean, what was I supposed to do? Develop another set of lecture notes to lecture from that was different from the lecture notes I handed out to them? These ungrateful students. But the students had a point. I was lecturing from my lecture notes. And if they would have read the book, they would have seen that the book wasn't that different from my lecture notes. Now, this picture that I've just described here takes place all over the world. Not just 30 years ago, but today, whether we're here in this country or any other country around the world. So that yields the question, is that what education is? Is education simply the transfer of information? I mean, that's not a crazy question, right? Because I'm sure that if we were to leave this hall right now and walk around campus and go into a random class, chances are that this is exactly what is happening, right? So my question is not that crazy. Is education simply the transfer of information? Let's do a little poll here. And we're going to use this technique later on too in my talk when I'm going to make it a little bit more interactive. Normally I would use clickers or we could use cell phones, but we're going to use a low-tech approach. I'm going to ask you multiple choice questions and then count to 3, 1, 2, 3. And at the count of 3 you have to put your hand on your chest, indicating the choice you make. So choice 1, 1 finger, choice 2, 2 fingers, choice 3, 3 fingers. If you do not put your hand on your chest, I'm going to come down the stairs there, go to you, put this microphone right in your face, and you're going to have to tell the whole room what your choice is. When I tell the same to my students, and when I tell them, quickly they put their hand on their chest. So here's the question. Is education simply the transfer of information? 1, Yes. 2, no, education is more than just the transfer of information. So make up your choice mentally. Shouldn't take too long. Now, at the count of 3, everyone, including the people in the back there, I like to run back and pick on people in the back. At the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, put your hand on your choice. Hold it there so I can see it. Wait, the person in the white there, this is not it. Oh, I see. You have your coat in front of your hand. I can't see. Okay. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. So why don't you all raise your hand, but don't change the number of fingers. Go up, everybody. Look around, quickly. Okay, so, you know, almost everybody has 2. There's maybe 1 or 2 or 3, I couldn't see that well, 1s. If you said 1, and you're a teacher, I have a warning for you. You are about to lose your job. Because let's assume for a moment that education is just the transfer of information. I think the consensus in this room is education is more than just the transfer of information. But let's assume for a moment that education were just a transfer of information. What would be the logical thing to do in the 21st century if that were true? If education is just a transfer of information, what should we do? Well, Google, I mean, I presume you mean putting the lectures on the internet. And in fact, it's already happening, right? What would happen if we took all of the classes taught at this university, at my university, and other universities? We take the best possible professors in physics and chemistry, biology, history, you name it, film it, put it online. What would we lose if we did that? Well, of course, we'd lose our jobs, right? But in addition to our jobs, what would we lose? What would we lose? Inspiration? Is that what you said? Values. Okay. Human contact, for sure. Interaction. But, wait a minute. How much interaction is there really in a classroom? I'm working really hard on trying to interact with you. It's not easy. It's not easy. In fact, whether I'm in Taiwan or in the US or in Europe, it's always difficult when you're in a space like this to interact. Why? Well, who is responsible for the architecture that you see here and that you see on the picture behind me? Where does this come from, this type of arrangement?
The Greeks.
The ancient Greek, exactly. The ancient Greek were the ones who thought about the amphitheater or the theater. Now, why did they design this architecture? For what purpose? For performances, exactly. Theater, music, plays, and so on. So that everybody could see and everybody could hear the performers. Did the ancient Greek use the amphitheater as a learning space? No. If you look at an illustration of the School of Athens, you see something very different. You see people walking around and talking and discussing. So the Greek were smart enough to use the amphitheater for performances and have that very separately from their approaches to teaching. But somewhere in medieval Europe, before Bologna, before the first universities were founded, people started to adopt the performance space as a learning space. Now remember, when you walked in here, about half an hour ago and sat down in this space, you sat down and unconsciously told yourself, I'm going to sit and listen to Eric Mazur present. You bring the same mindset to a classroom built like this one, or anything where all the people are looking in the same direction at the person in front. You bring the same mindset you bring when you go to a movie theater or a play or a concert. And in a play or a concert, it would be highly disruptive if you started to interact with the people on the stage. So therefore, you just sit there passively. You turn passive the moment you sit down in these seats. So all that, a long way of saying that I don't think there is much interaction, right? We wouldn't lose that interaction. On the other hand, I think we would gain something. Because you see, when you're listening to somebody speak, like you're listening to me speak now, there is very little time to think. Because once your mind starts wandering, you no longer listen to me, right? Suppose that I'm not talking about education, I'm talking about physics, and I'm telling you something that confuses you. I wonder. While your mind wonders how that works, the person in front of the classroom continues to talk. And you miss that information because your mind cannot listen and think at the same time. You either listen or you think. So therefore, you tell yourself, I'll think about this later, maybe you take a note, and there's very little time to think in a cognitively meaningful way in a classroom. Have you ever had a student in one of your classes raise his or her hand and say, Professor, could you please be quiet for 5 minutes? I need to think. It's never happened in my classes, but you have to admit that's the only way really to make space for thinking. We don't provide that space to our students in a live class. Online, you might be able to do that. Okay, I think I've picked enough on the people who said yes. So let me turn now to those of you who had two. No, education is more than just the transfer of information. So what more is it? Well, many of you said no, so you should have an idea. If it's not just information transfer, what else is it? Culture? Coaching. What else? This is not a hard question. Inspiring. That's interesting. Let's pause for a moment at inspiration. I have seen some YouTube videos and some TED Talks that are a whole lot more inspiring than most of the in-person classes I've taken in my career. So I think that the inspiration, doesn't necessarily come from the interaction together. I think that what is missing and what is necessary to go from just information transfer to being educated is that as a learner, you need to assimilate that information. You need to extract from the information the mental models, the knowledge, if you want, that permits you to apply what you've learned in a new context. You need to make sense of it. You need to have this aha moment. Oh, yes, now I understand it. And it took a long time for me to discover that that was not happening in my classrooms. You see, I started teaching that way, and very quickly, I got feedback that I was doing the right thing. In other words, my approach got reinforced. It got reinforced by two things. One, I got high evaluations from my students. Most people who teach physics to non-physics majors, which was what I was doing, get very low ratings. Most people don't like physics. Certainly not pre-meds, and I was teaching a pre-med class. But I got very high ratings. So I thought, wow, I must be a good teacher. On top of that, I could give my students some fairly difficult problems involving integrations, triple integrations, calculus, and they did well. I wasn't sure I would do well under the pressure of the exam, but by and large, they did well. So actually, very quickly, I started to believe that I was the world's best physics teacher. That was a complete illusion. Because after teaching that way for about, I think, 7 years, I read about a very simple word-based test that tested students' knowledge of the most basic concept in physics, force. No equations, no formulas, no drawings, nothing, just words. I looked at this test and I thought, this is way too simple for my students. But then the person who developed this test actually showed some data that had been obtained in, mostly on the west coast of the United States. But he showed that there's not much difference between the answers that the students give at the beginning of their physics course and the end of their physics course. Let me give you an example. This is the only physics that I'll give you today. Here's one example. A heavy truck and a light car collide head-on on the highway. Is the force exerted by the heavy truck on the light car, A, larger than that of the light car on the heavy truck? B, they're the same in magnitude? C, the light car exerts a larger force on the heavy truck than the other way around. Now, all students who have taken an introductory physics course can recite Newton's third law. You may have heard of it. Action is reaction. Or the force of object 1 on object 2 is the same as that of object 2 on object 1 when the two interact. In equation, F12 equals F21. They can all recite that. But apparently, if you replace 1 by heavy truck and 2 by light car, they forget all about Newton's third law and they're convinced the heavier truck exerts a larger force on the light car than the other way around. I thought, no way, not my students. But you see, I'm a scientist, so I've learned one thing. You don't just make assumptions, you prove it. So I thought, I'm going to give it to my students and show that my students have mastered this. Well, 5 minutes after starting to take this test, one student raised her hand, and I walked over to her, and she looked at me, and she asked, Professor Mazur, how should I answer these questions? According to what you taught us? Or according to the way I usually think about these things? I had no idea how to answer that question. And by the time the test had been completed, it was clear that my students had not mastered even the most basic principle in my course. And this was at the end of the semester. So that was kind of a shocking moment, and it became clear that, I'd been living in some kind of an illusionary world, thinking that I was actually teaching physics, whereas actually my students were simply getting through the course by memorization, simply by memorizing and by applying rote procedures, throwing creativity, throwing anything that's interesting out of the world. I mean, after all, I think science is something beautiful. It's something that we're all born to love. Just look at small children. They all ask, why? Until, after a few years of school, they all stop asking why, and the only thing they want to know is how to pass the test. So I started to rethink my approach to teaching, and I realized that education is sort of a two-step process. Transfer of information is important. No transfer of information, no education. But that's not sufficient. There has to be an opportunity for students to make sense of that information, to have the insights and the aha moments. I've often asked myself, where did that happen for me? And you may want to ask yourself that question too. Where did we go, oh, now I get it. Did that happen while you were sitting in a room like this listening to your professors? I see quite a few of you shake. No, it probably happened outside of the classroom when you were going over your notes or you were thinking, when you finally had time to think without somebody talking to you all the time. So, in the standard approach to teaching, step 1 takes place in class, and step 2 is left to the students on their own. Now, if you ask yourself, which of these two steps is the easy one? Step 1 or step 2? I think we'd all agree, step 1 is the easy step, especially now that we live in the 21st century where there are so many different ways of transferring information. So rather than spending this precious time that we as instructors have with our students on the easy step, we should really focus on that second step. That's where we should be there to help them, not for the transfer of information. We have lots of ways of transferring information. Books, MOOCs, YouTube videos, whatever, right? So that's when I came up with the idea of flipping this around. I didn't call it flipping at that time. I just called it inverting the sequence. Let's do one outside of the classroom so that in the classroom we can focus on this much harder second step. So I'm going to focus for a moment on the second step. And later, if there's some time left, I'll talk about the first step. The question I'd like to ask is, what do you do in the classroom if your students have successfully taken the responsibility for the transfer of information? And the answer to this question is nothing new. It's teach by questioning. Who said that first, by the way? Who was sort of one of the first people to say we should teach by questioning, not by telling? Socrates, exactly, 2,000 some years ago. And here we're in the 21st century and we're still mostly teaching by telling rather than teaching by questioning. Well, for me, it was a completely accidental discovery. It's not that I was thinking, oh, Socrates. No. You see, after taking this test that I just described about the force, not only was I shocked, my students were also shocked by how poorly they scored. And it was only, 2 weeks before the final exam, so they were very worried. So they asked me for a special session to go over every single question. I had about 250 students in my classroom, so a little bit like this. And I booked a large auditorium from 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. at night. And during those 3 hours, I went through every single question. And I remember coming to this question of the car and the truck. So I thought, that's easy, Newton's third law. So I turned my back to the students. I made a drawing of the car on one side of the board, the truck on the other. I drew the force of gravity on the truck, the force of gravity on the car, the force of the road up on the truck, the force of the road up on the car, and then the force of the car on the truck and the truck on the car. And I turned around and I said, by Newton's third law, these two forces are the same. What more is there to say about it, right? And I looked and I could see from their faces that they were confused. So I said, is there a question? They were so confused they could not articulate a question. So I thought, this is serious, Maybe they're confused that the effect on the car is bigger, but that's because the car is light and the truck is heavy. So a force of equal magnitude will have less of an effect on the car than the truck. So anyway, so I erased the board, I started all over again, and I brought in Newton's second law in addition to Newton's third law. I mean, for 8 minutes, I gave the most brilliant explanation you could possibly imagine. After 8 minutes, the whole board was covered with equations and drawings. I'd explained every little detail. Of course, I'd done this with my back to them. So I turned around. They looked even more confused. And they could still not articulate a question. I didn't know what to do. I thought, I have tried it in 2 different ways. I really don't know how to explain it any better than I did. So in a moment of despair, I said, why don't you just discuss it with each other? And something happened that I had never seen in my classroom. Complete chaos. Okay? They were all talking to each other. They forgot about me in front of the classroom. I could have walked away. They would not even have noticed it. But what was even more surprising was that in just 2 minutes, they figured it out. I thought at first, how can that be I, the expert, have tried for 10 minutes in 2 different ways to explain it to them unsuccessfully, but they talk to each other for 2 minutes and they figure it out. But imagine you have 2 students sitting next to each other, Mary and John. Mary understands it and has the right answer. John does not understand it and does not have the right answer. On average, Mary will be more likely to convince John than the other way around, simply by the force of logic. I won't say this always works that way, but on average, it will be that way. But what's more important is this. Mary is more likely to convince John than Professor Mazur in front of the class. Why? Because she has only recently learned it. She still knows what the difficulties are that the beginning learner has. Whereas Professor Mazur learned it such a long time ago, to him it's so clear that he cannot even understand why somebody doesn't get it. Maybe you can sort of associate with that feeling, either as a student or a teacher. As a teacher, you get a student who comes to you, asks you a question, and you can't even understand what the question really is about. Or when you were a student, you would often not even bother asking the professor. You'd ask somebody else in the classroom if he or she could explain it. It's what my colleague, the famous psychologist Steven Pinker, calls the curse of knowledge. It's kind of an ironic statement. The better you know something, the more difficult it becomes to explain it to a beginning learner. Because we tend to forget. We tend to forget our own struggles. Over the years, things become clearer and clearer. And we don't see the mental obstacles anymore that our students face. Anyway, when I saw that, I thought, wow, I should use this when I'm teaching. So now, I ask my students to read my notes before coming to class. And then in class, I'll talk a few minutes, and I put a question on the screen. And after I put the question on the screen, I give them time to think. It's completely silent in the classroom. They actually can think about the question. Then I poll them. Initially, we did it with fingers on the chest, like you just did, and then we had clickers. You may have seen clickers in the classroom. That started, 20-some years ago in my classroom. And, now you can just use cell phones to poll your students. I try to aim the question so that this first time, between 30 and 70% of the students get the desired answer. Note that I say desired answer, not correct answer. In physics, the desired answer might be the correct answer, but in many other disciplines, that might not be a correct answer. And much to my surprise, this approach to teaching has sort of spread to many disciplines, from management to humanities, where there might not be one single correct answer. So I try to get between 30 and 70% correct answers. If that's the case, I tell my students, find a neighbor who has a different answer and try to convince the person that you're right and he or she is wrong. Complete chaos for about 2 minutes. And then I poll them again. And if we're between 30 and 70%, it's not unusual to go to 80, 90, or sometimes even very close to 100% desired answer. Why between 30 and 70? Well, if there's less than 30% who have the desired answer, there's just not enough students to teach the other students. If there's more than 70, it's going to be hard to find somebody who has a different answer. So that's why that percentage is the best. And then we wrap up with an explanation, which can be either me explaining it or one of the students in the audience. And then that cycle repeats until the class time is up. And of course, the real learning, the aha moments take place during this discussion. It's actually phenomenal. I stand there and I can actually see students go, oh. You see it in front of you. It's just amazing when that happens. Let me show you a little video from my... So we have a rectangular loop that is placed in a uniform magnetic field in the direction indicated by these arrows. So the question is, what are the magnetic forces on the 4 different sides of this loop? So take a minute to think about this and then enter your answers. Please enter your answers. We have a disagreement clearly here. So turn to your neighbor and see if you can convince one another of the correct choice.
Right. It goes out of the page and on the top it goes in, so they cancel each other out.
There is a torque.
There is a torque.
How do you know that?
I said
What did you say? But how can it be a torque?
Initially we had sort of an even split. And now we have an absolutely overwhelming majority for choice number 2. The bottom of this loop is pulled towards you. The top is pushed away. What is that? A net torque. So, do you want to try this? Let's decide. I'd hoped a little bit more enthusiasm here. Let's try this again. Do you want to try this? Okay, good. So, I hope that you all read the 2 paragraphs that were emailed to you about thermal expansion. No? Did I forget to email it? I'm just kidding here. But you know what that means, because I'm going to ask you a question on thermal expansion. Since you didn't read about it, I have to lecture you. Actually, you know what? I'm very happy to have this opportunity because I don't lecture in my own classes anymore and I miss it. So, anyway, thermal expansion deals with the fact that hard solids, not soft solids, but hard solids like steel or wood or concrete expand when they get hotter and they shrink when they get colder. I mean, you know, if you put a pan on the stove and you turn on the flame, it's not getting twice as big. You know, you don't expect your pan to become much bigger. But if you were to very accurately measure the width of your pan, you'd see that it expands a tiny little bit, a fraction of a percent as it heats up, and it shrinks again when it gets colder. And this is actually, you may think this is a purely an academic subject, but it's actually very important in daily life. If you've ever been in a train at low speed, so not the high-speed railway that goes from north to south here in Taiwan, but you know, an old train that goes at low speed, you may have heard this clickety-clack sound as it goes from one section of the rail to the other. You may wonder, why don't they put the rails against each other? Why do they leave this little gap there? Well, they leave this little gap because if the weather gets hotter, the rail expands, and if there's no space to expand, then bad things happen. The rail will actually buckle. So when you build big buildings like Taipei 101, you need to take into account this expansion of the steel that makes up the core of this building. It's very important for engineers to take that into account. Next time that you go to the airport or to a parking structure on the campus, look down and you'll see that as you look at the concrete and you walk, every 10 meters or so there's a rubber strip. The concrete sections are, you know, spaced with a little gap in between so that when it gets hotter, the concrete can expand, compressing the rubber so that the structure remains sound. You may think, oh, all of that doesn't affect me that much. It actually does. Next time that you go to the dentist, think about this. Dentist fills a cavity in one of your teeth with a mixture of metals called amalgam that is chosen in such a way as to very carefully match the expansion of your tooth. If it was just an ordinary metal that they put in, next time you drink hot tea, the metal expands more than your tooth, and crack, the tooth will break in two. So it's something that actually affects you. Now, the reason solids expand is that they're made from atoms. I'm showing 9 of them here. And atoms in a solid hold each other in place. So these hold each other in place. But when it gets hotter, they get further away from each other. So this is hot, and this is cold. Hot and cold. Now you may wonder, why is it that the atoms get further away from each other when it gets hotter? I'm not going to test you on this, but it's important maybe to know. The reason is that atoms don't sit still, they vibrate. And the amplitude of that vibration is related to what we call temperature. So small amplitude, cold. Large amplitude, hot. So if you were an atom sitting there in a regular pattern, as you are, you wouldn't just sit still. You'd actually be shaking back and forth. And as it gets hotter, you'd shake more. And you need more space. You're basically pushing everybody around you further away. And it's not just those 9 atoms there. It's all the atoms that make up a solid. There are millions of billions of atoms. So cold and hot. Questions, anyone? Well, thank you. I knew I was a brilliant lecturer and everything was clear. But you know, I'm not simply going to hide the screen and then ask you, when solids get hotter, they expand because A, the atoms get closer together, B, the same distance, C, they get further apart. That would be simply me transferring information to you and you transferring that same information back to me. That's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to say, if you can take this picture of atoms getting further away from each other when it gets hot, all of them, and apply that to a different context. So you better ask me questions. Cold and hot. Okay, are you all ready for my question? Okay, so this is how we're going to do it. I'm going to ask you the question, and you are not allowed to talk to your neighbor, okay? If I hear you talk to your neighbor, I will run to you and ask you to tell the whole room what you just told your neighbor, out of fairness, right? Okay. So then we're going to vote. Everybody will vote, 1, 2, or 3, or however many answers there are. And then, only then, will I ask you to find a neighbor who has a different answer. So if you turn to your right, and the person to your right has the same answer, say, thank you very much, and you turn to the person on your left. If that person also has the same answer, you turn to the person in front of you. If everybody around you has the same answer, do not assume that you're all correct. Get up, walk around, find somebody in the room who has a different answer. Instructions clear? Okay, so here we go. Consider a rectangular metal plate, shown here, with a circular hole in it. Now suppose we take this plate with a circular hole and we heat it uniformly so it gets hotter everywhere. What happens to the diameter of the hole as the metal expands? Will the diameter of the hole get larger? 1, 2, stay the same. 3, decrease. So think about this. And if you formulated an answer, if you think, oh, it is answer, then ask yourself, how am I going to explain somebody else that I'm correct? Okay, well, in the interest of time, if you have not made up your mind now, then just make it a game, okay? Just guess. But you have to vote. Whether you're sure or not, you have to choose 1, 2, or 3. You must, right? Because I'm going to ask you to put your hand on your chest, voting 1, 2, or 3. And if you don't, I'm going to ask you to stand up and tell the whole room which answer you pick. So you better do it. Okay, so at the count of 3. 1, 2, and 3. Everybody. 4? There's no 4. Oh, no. Okay. Now hold it there for a second so I can see. Okay, I see 1s, I see 2s, I see 3s. I see everything. But interestingly enough, there are clusters. Clusters of 1, clusters of 3. So you may have to walk around to find somebody who has a different answer. Go ahead. Find somebody who has a different answer. If you're not talking to somebody, I will come and talk to you. Now look at that. You all got engaged. Look, they're still continuing to talk. Look at that there. You're still, hello? He hasn't even noticed that I started talking again, right? So different from when I'm lecturing. I'm sure that by now most of you have forgotten that I'm not here to talk about thermal expansion. I'm here to talk about education. The answer to this question doesn't even matter. I've already shown how different it is. Now, I'm sure you want to know the answer, but before I tell you the answer, let's analyze what happened here. I asked you a question, and you thought about it, and then I had you make a commitment by putting your hand on your chest. And after you make that commitment, I asked you to externalize that answer. You have to turn to somebody and say, I chose because blah, 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 and so on. And something interesting happened. You were all talking in Chinese, which I don't understand. But you were gesticulating exactly the same way people in other parts of the world are gesticulating. Everybody was, like this. So what happened was you were no longer talking about the answers, but about the reasons for the answers. You were thinking and talking like a physicist. In a sense, it shifts the focus away from the answer to the reasoning. It brings the reasoning, the thinking as a process back into the classroom. But most importantly of all, you became emotionally invested in the learning process. If I were to say, oh, I'm sorry, I have to go, bye, and go through those doors, many of you would come after me to ask, what's the answer to that question? Now, before I can give you the answer, we have to vote a second time. Remember, vote, discussion, vote again. So I want you to vote again. If you have not changed your mind, you vote the same thing. If you have changed your mind, you indicate what you now believe to be correct. So at the count of 3, 1, 2, and 3, everybody. I thought I'd given a pretty clear lecture about thermal expansion. And so did you, because only one person, no, 2, had the courage to ask a question. So, if I had not asked this question, I would have thought I gave a very clear lecture about thermal expansion. And you might have thought Eric Mazur gave a pretty clear lecture about thermal expansion. Less than 1/3 of you got the correct answer. Which means that you actually have made a very important point. Because by the way you've voted, you've been telling me, Eric, your lecturing sucks. Which is precisely the point I wanted to make here. It may look and sound like it's clear, but you really haven't had a chance to think about it. If you had read about this before class, you might have had the chance to think about it and brought more to class, but you didn't read before class. You should have read before class. I'm just kidding. So the right answer is, look at that. Everybody is looking at me. There's not one person, texting, or it's just amazing. The right answer is, can I have a drum beat here? The right answer is number 1. Let me, remember, I'm not here to talk about thermal expansion. I just wanted to show you the process. But I don't want you to lie in bed tonight at 2 a.m. wide awake. So let me take another precious minute of my time to explain to you why it expands. Suppose you have a jar of marmalade or pickles or whatever in the refrigerator. It's a glass jar with a metal lid. You take it out of the refrigerator, you try to open it, you can't open it. What do? You run or you either tap on it, but you run the lid under hot water. And the lid is a ring and a plate, and the ring expands so that the hole gets larger. You say, well, you didn't ask about a jar, you asked about a plate. Okay, so imagine you have, I'm going to use this envelope as a prop. Imagine you have a plate, no hole. This is the plate, no hole. Now we take a pen and we draw a circle on this plate. So we have a plate with a circle. We put the plate with the circle in the oven. We turn up the temperature. The plate expands. What happens to the diameter of the circle? it gets larger. You say, well, that's unfair. There's no hole. If there was a hole, then the atoms would have expanded into the hole. Let me show you what's wrong with that. Let's say that a group of us goes here on the stage and we form a circle holding hands. Big circle. Each dot is one of us. And each one of us represents an atom. We're holding hands there. And now we step in towards the center of the hole. What just happened to the distance between us? The distance between us gets smaller. Can't get smaller because everybody's shaking more. We need to get further away from each other. The only way to make the distance between us larger is to remove a few of us, but atoms don't disappear like that, or to make the whole larger. You won't forget that. Now, by the way, I forgot to make a very important point. Imagine I had given the exact same lecture that I did about thermal expansion, and instead of asking you the question, I would simply have said, if we take a plate with a circle, and put it in the oven, and we turn up the temperature, the whole expands. I would just have told you that. You would all have been sleeping. I mean, what is more boring than rectangular metal plates with circular holes in it? Look at you now, right? Isn't it amazing how you can reawaken the curiosity of the human mind and take something that is not at all that interesting if you just tell and make it interesting? Okay, so back to peer instruction. The first year that I used this method, I showed a doubling of the learning gains, and over time we went to a tripling of the learning gains between the beginning of the semester and the end of the semester. And people have reproduced this in many studies and in many disciplines around the world over the past 25 years. And also, there's better retention because, you know, once you have this aha moment, once you get it for life. You don't just memorize it in order to pass the test, and I think that's what's important in education. I want to end by pausing for a moment about the difference between interactive teaching and not interactive teaching is that there's an interaction between people. Think about it. In the standard approach to education, everything is focused on the individual. Yes, you're sitting together here in the room, but unless I give you an opportunity to interact with each other, you're essentially isolated from the others, listening to the person in front of the classroom. In most classrooms, it's a very isolating environment. You might be able to talk to your neighbor before the class starts and after the class, but during the class, you're there alone, listening to the professor. At the exam, on the assessment, you're separated from each other. You're separated from any source of information. It's again just you by yourself. Then later, when you graduate and you start working, whether it's in academia or in industry, you never work alone. You always work with other people. Interaction between people is crucial in the workplace. Yet for some reason, education is completely focused on the individual. And we somehow hope that by focusing on the individual in education, we generate people who are able to effectively collaborate in the workplace. And I'm afraid that's not the case. In fact, most problems in industry, in academia, in companies, is people not being able to work together. And that's why I think the social part of the interaction should really begin in education. Earlier, I had said that it was Socrates who said we should teach by questioning, not by telling. But in Chinese culture, too, you have that. Confucius said, you know, whenever you have several people together, there's bound to be one who can teach the others, because you take what is good from one and you ignore what is bad from the other. But likewise, it was recently pointed out to me that the Chinese word for knowledge, shu e wun, actually means to study, the first character, and asking questions, the second one. So it's embedded deeply in Chinese culture that, you know, you learn by asking questions. So I think it's really important to sort of rekindle people's curiosity and people's drive to innovate by teaching, by asking questions. So I hope that I have convinced you that education is not just about transferring information. We are never going to help people become more innovative by just transferring information. Also, we don't want our students just to do what we can do. I want my students to stand on my shoulders. I want my students to solve the problems that I cannot yet solve. And I don't think that I teach them that by showing them how I solve a problem. They have to work on solving problems. And I think this is particularly important in the 21st century. 50 years ago, over the past 50 years or so ago, we've seen that a lot of jobs at the lower part of the socioeconomic distribution have been lost to robots. I predict that in the next 50 years, a lot of jobs are going to be lost to artificial intelligence and, computers. So we better teach our students what these devices cannot do. And creativity and innovation are one of them. And we better start focusing, because 50 years from now, a lot of jobs, and not at the lower end of the socioeconomic distribution, no, all across, lawyers, accountants, doctors even, could well be lost to information technology. So that's why we really must start to focus in academia now on the type of task that these devices cannot do. And I think one important and simple step that we all can do is to really focus on active engagement and social engagement within the classroom. Thank you very much.